MNP, and we have Mr. Paul Kavanagh here on behalf of MNP to introduce our speaker. Let's show our appreciation to the sponsor, please.
Hey there. As he said, my name is Paul Kavanagh. I'm with MNP's Technology Consulting Practice. I'm part of the team that provides the IT services, part of MNP's end-to-end digital advisory and implementation service. Working together with our management consulting, business advisory, and digital consultancy. Sorry, 1 second here. We provide solutions that address your changing needs wherever business takes you. At MNP, we recognize that no two industries are exactly alike. National in scope, local in focus, our teams deliver informed market insight to ensure that the right decisions are made for your business. We can help excel in diverse industries and a variety of market sectors. MNP is pleased to be presenting sponsor of this speaker series, Developing Tomorrow's Smart Cities. Fawn Rice is a research and policy analyst at the Information and Communications Technology Council, ICTC, and a social scientist whose previous research has focused on technologies used in museums to enhance the visitor experience, as well as strategies for endangered language documentation and revitalization. With ICTC, Fawn brings her perennial interest in human social organization to bear on the impact of emerging technologies and smart cities on policy, the labor market, and urban and rural life in Canada. MNP is pleased to sponsor this speaker session for the 2020 SUMA Convention.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here today. Please do feel welcome to come up a bit closer. We have a bit of a cozy session today, so I know there's a bit of space back there. And I'm just going to begin by telling you a little bit more about who ICTC is. So I'm here from the Information and Communications Technology Council. My contact info is up here. Please feel free to get in touch with me over email about any questions that come up during this session. ICTC is a national organization about 25 years old. It's based in Ottawa. I'm based in Vancouver. We have offices across the country, and we have 4 different streams. We have research and policy, which I'm a part of, and that produces evidence-based policy and research about the Canadian digital economy. We have talent programs, education and skills programs, and online tools, for example, that connect newcomers with relevant jobs to their experience in Canada. Some of our talent and education programs include, for example, cybersecurity for high schoolers. That's a Cyber Titan program. We do some co-op subsidies, et cetera. So we're quite a wide-reaching organization. And on this slide here, we just have a few papers listed that are our work on smart cities in Canada. So again, you can access this slide afterwards. But, oh, thank you so much.
No problem. Should just click in there.
Oh yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I'll make sure it works.
Cheers. So these links, hyperlinks here, link to some of the research that we've been doing on smart cities in Canada, and we have a program with the Government of Canada currently to pursue a smart city project, which is one of the reasons why we're here today with SUMA. It's okay, I can just click. It's all good.
Okay.
Yeah, you're fine. Thank you. So today, in this session, we're going to go over a few different things. We're going to talk about what is a smart city, because it's a bit of a buzzword, right? We want to unpack it and ground it in reality. We're going to talk about what does it mean to design a smart city project in Canada, what technologies are involved, and how are other Canadian cities implementing them, what security and privacy concerns should be considered, does a smart city have to be a big city, is a really relevant Canadian consideration, and then we're going to save a bit of time for discussion. So when people use the word smart, it doesn't always connote a good thing, right? Sometimes we hear smart and we get worried that something's going to work less well instead of better. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with CES. It's a big trade show that happens in Vegas every year. In 2017, Forbes posted a list of the silliest technologies at CES. And amongst these, my favorite was the smart toaster. And the smart toaster is a Bluetooth-enabled toaster that you have to get very close to with your phone because Bluetooth is near field, of course, and you tell it exactly how well toasted you would like your toast to be. And of course, because it's a toaster, you still have to put your toast into the toaster to make it work. So sometimes when we hear the word smart, we think of something that's duplicating something that already functions effectively to make it less efficient, more expensive. The smart toaster is about $200. Less secure. I mean, presumably you have to download an app to use your smart toaster, so somebody could hack into it and steal your personal information. And more invasive. Again, with the app, who knows what other information it's collecting about you. So this is sometimes what we think of when we hear the word smart, and this is not what we want our smart city to be. So what do we want our smart city to be? And what does a smart city even mean? There's a lot of definitional ambiguity. Some common definitions are very simple and very linear. Wikipedia, which is of course crowdsourced wisdom, says that a smart city is an urban area that uses different types of electronic Internet of Things sensors to collect data and then use insights gained from that data to manage assets, resources, and services efficiently. So this is a very nice kind of linear idea, right? We start with the Internet of Things, we create insights, and then we've achieved success. We've achieved our smart city. Very simple, but of course there's a lot of different things both within and between all of these steps that aren't being considered by this model. And this is what we hear all the time. You collect data, then you've got a smart city. And the focus on that one step in the process isn't really conducive to any kind of urban planning. As I'm sure most of you in the room know, I'm sure you work in policy in municipalities. So a smart city really needs to be more than just data collection. Collecting data is just one step. Once you have that data, you have to keep it secure and private. You have to analyze it. You have to use it for effective and sustainable planning. And you have to use that planning to deliver equitable, evidence-based services. And then most importantly, and this is a big step that people often forget, is we also have to engage with citizens as a part of this process, both to evaluate the systems that we've developed and to create transparency. And it isn't even as simple as this. Each of these steps has an additional number of considerations. When we collect data, we have to be collecting it for well-articulated goals, not just for no reason, in an organized catalog manner. So we have to think, do we have a data inventory? Do we know what data assets we have? Without collecting extra data unintentionally. So if we have cameras that we're using, for example, what else are those cameras picking up? And while avoiding data silos. So let's use the example of smart parking, for example, which is a common smart cities example. Very simple. You have a congested city. People have a hard time figuring out where to park. So you put sensors in parking spots. They say that, yes, there's a car here. No, there's not a car here. Your citizens can download an app and check and see where their parking might be. They can maybe book it and reserve it online using their credit card, et cetera. While avoiding data silos is really interesting because you might have one municipality with this parking app, but then you might have 4 suburbs around that municipality. In Vancouver, we have this problem, that have their own parking app, and then you've duplicated all of those efforts, and everybody's using different data that isn't speaking to each other. Once we have it, we have to keep it secure and private, and that means avoiding data breaches. So if we have our parking app, what credit card information is stored on that could be stolen? What personalized information are we collecting? Are we balancing interoperability and privacy? So if we make our parking app speak to the parking apps of all those suburbs, does that violate privacy? Does that mean the citizens of Vancouver are giving permission for their data to be used by Vancouver, but it's being transmitted to Surrey without their permission, for example? And are we accurately classifying open data and private data? And that's a topic we'll talk about a bit later. We have to analyze it correctly, efficiently, and without bias. And those are all 3 huge challenges in and of themselves. We have to use it for effective and sustainable planning. So we have to interpret it in a way that usefully informs policy goals, balance efficiency, return on investment, and sustainability. And of course, that's no easy task. And then when we're delivering services, we need to navigate buy-in and opt-out. Just a quick show of hands, for example, how many people here downloaded the SUMA app for this conference? Excellent, that is very good buy-in. So that's a classic case of a buy-in challenge. How do you get people to download the app that you want them to be using? And SUMA has obviously done an excellent job. and opt out. So for example, with the parking app situation again, you might have citizens who say, I want to use this, but I don't want you to be collecting X data about me, or I don't want you to be able to sense my car. And that's an interesting challenge that cities will have to learn to navigate. Coordinating across different departments and vendors, reaching citizens in need, and avoiding duplication. Again, with maybe not different suburbs, but if you have a parking app, do you have a different app that people have to use to access the city's open data? So do you have a situation where there's 3 different apps for the city of Edmonton, for example, that people have to buy to try to use? And then engage with citizens. So how do we create genuine and wide-reaching engagement while navigating privacy concerns and building digital literacy so that all of our citizens know how to use the apps that we're giving them? So now, of course, we have a very complicated slide up here to explain smart cities, and cities are themselves quite complicated. The other important thing to notice about this is it's a cycle, right? It's not this nice linear, we have the IoT, then we have success, and we're done. It's more of a question of, we've created a policy, we've engaged with citizens, now how do we reevaluate that over time? Because, of course, a policy doesn't stay perfect forever. So our smart cities are more than just technology. We're going to talk a lot about technology today, but each smart city is supported by technology, but also involves people, infrastructure, and policy. So throughout the talk, we're going to go through some examples of Canadian smart city projects that involve all 4 of these aspects and do a good job of that cycle, as well as talking about the technologies they use. So on the collecting data step, smart cities may use sensors, cameras, and crowdsourcing mechanisms, because of course people can collect data too, to gather information about everyday urban patterns like mass transit use. So some technologies that support these programs include IoT hardware and software, and of course IoT itself isn't really a technology, it's more of an idea that is supported by a wide variety of technologies, the Internet of Things, that includes communications infrastructure, such as low-power, long-range networks, which are networks that are very good for disseminating small packages of data over long distances. For the parking app, for example, again, it's saying car is here, car is not here. That's not something you need 5G, right? You just need a low-power, long-range network. We also have cellular networks, public Wi-Fi, satellites, all kinds of hardware and software that support our ability to collect data. So here's an example of a Canadian city that has done this quite well. Winnipeg has instigated a traffic management center. It was a $3-ish million project. And so what they've done is they put cameras at intersections across Winnipeg. The cameras allow the people, the staff in the traffic management center to monitor traffic, collisions, weather conditions, et cetera, and then go in and manually change lights if they see it's necessary. The other data collection stream Winnipeg has here is a partnership with the traffic app Waze. Is anyone or everyone familiar with Waze? It's like a Google Maps alternative that allows people to go in and autofill data. So Google tells you your best route, and that's it. Waze will tell you your best route, but then allow you to correct it if it's wrong, or say, today there was an accident here, or say, today there's a pothole here, or controversially, today there's a police person here, slow down. And so this is an interesting kind of crowdsourcing mechanism that Waze uses to optimize routes for people in the morning, but it also partners with cities in order to give them the same information. So if somebody says there's an accident at this intersection, not only does Waze, the traffic app, know, but also the city of Winnipeg knows. So the city of Winnipeg uses both sensors, cameras, and people, crowdsourcing, to collect information, analyze it, attempt to optimize traffic, integrate it with their other transportation options, and then turn that back to citizens and engage with them using things like their Twitter page. You can see here. So they're not just switching lights manually in the traffic center, they're also passing this back to people, allowing them to tweet back, ask questions, and get real-time updates. So this is just one example of a Canadian city using data collection for a smart city type of program. The next step in the cycle I showed you on the complex slide was security, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But step number 3 is data analysis. So once we have the data, what do we do with it? So smart cities can use big data platforms. We hear a lot about machine learning, computer vision, natural language processing, and other technologies to interpret data. And of course, AI is a big old category that's still being developed, which includes machine learning, machine vision, natural language processing, and other technologies. Data management software solutions, including the cloud. All of these are kind of technologies that can support the data analysis process, although a lot of this is, of course, still done by humans, and is, of course, still done best by humans. So I will mention Toronto, but not the Sidewalk Labs Smart Cities thing. This is a different project they have. Toronto has the enviable problem of having too much data. So they had a huge number of data sets that they were attempting to make open for the public. For example, parking, bicycle usage, the amount of energy that different public buildings were using. But they were measuring success in this open data project by how many data sets they'd published, rather than the quality of those data sets, who was using them, how much, in what ways, etc. So Toronto created an open data master plan, the aim of which was to kind of fix this problem of having so much data available to citizens that no one's using and no one knows how to use. So with this master plan, they use machine learning integrated software to prioritize which data sets are the most important for the public, and also give them a data quality rating. So how recent is it? How usable is it? If I download the Excel spreadsheet, do I understand what the columns mean, or are they meaningless kind of numbers? Toronto, therefore, has done a really good job of using, again, a software technology-supported tool to create something that's really valuable for people that can also be used as a policy tool. And here's an example of what their open data portal looks like. So here's just a map of bicycle parking options in the city of Toronto. But I think the most interesting part is the left-hand column. So they've given it a data quality score, and if you click on it, interact with it, it'll tell you why that's silver instead of gold or silver instead of bronze. It also tells you when it's refreshed, so how recent is this data, when was it last updated, which is really key because you don't want to be looking at this map that's from 2016 and then go try to park your bicycle and there's nothing there. It tells you the data type, and then it's tagged with a variety of other subject matter. The other thing that they've done that's quite neat is they have a second portal for things that citizens have done. So Toronto puts the data sets up, and then people can go on, download the data set, and do what they choose with it, and then re-upload whatever they create, be it a game, an app, a map, or citizen-made research and analysis. So the example here is someone who went on, downloaded a data set, and created a map of the most ticketed areas in Toronto. So this tells you where not to park, which is not something that the city itself might have done, but they let the people do it, which is a neat use of their open data portal. So back to step 2, which is keeping information secure, technologies for security and privacy. So smart cities, we emphasize data collection a lot, but that also creates a whole bunch of problems, right? Smart cities guard individual privacy, or attempt to, and maintain strict security guidelines through both technology and policy. So some of the technologies that support this: cybersecurity for internet-enabled devices, cybersecurity training software for personnel, advanced encryption, distributed ledger technology, which is a bit of a buzzword, but that's the kind of parent category of blockchain, which we hear a lot about, and other innovations for enhanced user control of data, as well as tech for accurately identifying and labeling PII. So something like facial recognition software is a big problem we're hearing a lot about. Some companies are trying to use something like facial recognition software to go in and figure out when data should be cut from a data set, because it can tell when it would be identifying or when it wouldn't. And just to show you an example of some of the challenges that come up with this, we were talking about Toronto and the value of open data. We can also talk about the drawbacks of open data. So this is a heat map by the fitness app Strava. And so Strava is an app that could be in your Fitbit, or your phone, that lets you track your jogs or your cycles, et cetera. And they always auto-update a map of wherever the users in the world are using their application to track exercise. So here we can see Regina, right? And this tells us, you know, people really like jogging around the lake. And does anyone have any guesses of what the other image is? Pardon? It's not transportation. It's usually people are using it just for exercise. The image on the right, next to, pardon? It is an American military base in Afghanistan. Yeah, so of course, we're very close. So the soldiers were using the fitness app to track their jogs and their cycles. And then this ended up lighting up the interior map of a military base, which is supposed to be secret and highly defensed. So you can see that, you know, this is not to say open data is always a problem, just to say that there are so many things that we won't even anticipate occurring, right? There's no personally identifying information attached to this. You can't tell who it is, but still something happened that was potentially quite unsafe. So as these technologies emerge, we're going to keep encountering problems that we can't anticipate and learn how to deal with them. Strava has since, I think, updated their security settings so that US military bases don't get lit up in quite so clear definition. So an example of a city that's doing some really interesting work on this. This is not Canadian. This is Barcelona. I wanted to talk a little bit about the EU because they're doing such interesting things. There's a pilot project occurring that's funded by the European Commission in Barcelona and Amsterdam, and it's called Decode, which I believe stands for Decentralized Citizen-Owned Data Ecosystems. And what it's essentially trying to do is to create scenarios where people can control how much of their data is released. So let's say with the fitness app Strava, I want to allow the app to collect my data because it lets me know how fast I run, but I don't necessarily want to share that with everybody. They're trying to create a system where you could say, for example, you can share it but only for 15 minutes, or share it only with local government, because I think that would help them provide a valuable service, or anonymous except for friends and family. So trying to create a data ecosystem where it's not just all or nothing. You know, if you're signing up for the app, you have to give away all of your data, or you have to not download it at all. This is the kind of project that Europe is working on right now, which I think is really exciting. The other kinds of pilots they're working on in Amsterdam and Barcelona have to do with secure digital voting and all kinds of other slightly futuristic but very exciting programs that we hope to see come to fruition in the future. So skipping ahead, again in that cyclical diagram, we'll talk a little bit about smart city projects that deliver services and long-term planning. So smart cities use their insights to design and deliver smart services in accessible and effective ways. These services improve both urban efficiency and quality of life for all, ideally. So these could include shared transit services and transit plans, electric vehicle and autonomous vehicle infrastructure, smart utilities, or tech for sustainability. And here's another example of a Canadian city. So this is Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, a town of about 8,500 people. And Bridgewater won the Infrastructure Canada grant. Was anyone part of a team that put together a smart cities proposal for the grant program? Yeah? So Bridgewater won the $5 million category. And their smart cities proposal to Infrastructure Canada was to reduce energy poverty, which I believe they define as a household spending more than 10% of their household income on energy costs. So they came forward with this plan that was looking at integrating smart grids and other kind of smart cities technology to incentivize renovations and then track the outcomes of what happens if somebody's energy poverty is reduced with their health. Are they breathing cleaner air? Are they able to go to work more often, et cetera? So they have this this nice we've introduced smart tech, we have a policy component of subsidizing renovations, and we also track outcomes. And another interesting thing about Bridgewater is when ICTC talked to their team, they are doing it almost entirely as a municipality. So they don't have a big vendor signed on to help them with this. They're doing it through their municipal software. They will probably end up working with a variety of smaller vendors with the smart meters in houses, et cetera, but they have control over all the citizens' data, which is important because they're working in part with health outcomes. So this is just an interesting example that I'd encourage you to read a bit more about, because it's a great example of how a smaller municipality can come up with a very well-defined problem, a very well-defined solution, and then implement it with the smart cities tech. So it's not just the Torontos of the world who are working on this kind of program. A city like Bridgewater can be quite nimble because it also has control over zoning, it has control over policy, it has quite a few advantages compared to something like Toronto, which, as some of you may know, has been trying to get a smart cities project off the ground that's taken them like 3 years because there are so many policy negotiations that have to occur. So just to summarize some of the things we've talked about a working definition of a smart city, quite complex, quite cyclical. The fact that data collection is only one step in many. That data collection without aim or limitation may cause additional security and privacy problems. That tech and infrastructure must be complemented by policy and people. And that we hope that our Canadian smart cities are better than the smart toaster, but we might not be Singapore, and that's fine. I don't think that's what we're aiming for. So functional Canadian smart cities lie somewhere in between and is achievable for any size of municipality. And that's it for now. I'm hoping we can have a bit of a discussion about how these ideas relate to what you're trying to achieve in your own towns and cities. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. First of all, let's give Fawn a round of applause for the presentation. Thank you so much. So we've got some time left here for either some discussion or some questions. And so if she said anything that triggered questions or you'd like to ask her anything, please come to the mic. Just state your name and go ahead and ask your question. We've got some time for some questions here.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is if anyone has an example of something that they're working on in their hometown that related to some of the ideas, please feel free to share as well.
That'd be great. Okay, Councillor O'Donnell's going to come. State your name, please, sir.
Thank you. Mike O'Donnell, City of Regina. How are you?
Good, thanks. Yourself. And you said you were working on the Smart Cities grant, right?
We did one, yes. Unfortunately, we did not succeed.
It was quite a competition.
But yes, but
Yeah.
it was worthwhile. A comment first.
Yeah.
American cities have taken the notion that there isn't an option about becoming smart. This is what they are preaching to one another, that's what we have to do. That's one thought. I'm looking for a comment from you. Data and ownership and the word trust. So in North America, data particularly is private. If we go to China, it's public, but there are other issues with that. So if you would just comment on that notion of who owns data and the notion of trust.
That's a huge topic. I think who owns data is an interesting privacy consideration and a policy consideration that, as you say, different countries might define differently. I think in North America, there's a growing desire on behalf of citizens to own their own data, and we're just beginning to learn how difficult that is to implement. For example, Europe, which I think is often quite far ahead in these discussions, implemented GDPR, which is its privacy regulation. Are you familiar? The General Data Protection Regulation. And it's been heralded as one of the most ambitious bills and far-reaching bills or regulatory attempts to kind of control privacy with things such as the right to be forgotten, so that an individual can contact someone like Facebook and say, you are mandated to delete all of my files. But something even the EU is finding is that I think only 1% or less of claims that people bring forward under GDPR are then followed through with a fine, because there are so many cases where individuals are bringing forward a concern, but the regulatory body doesn't have the power, doesn't have the people power and doesn't have the scope to always enforce them. You know, even if you give someone like Google a multi-million-dollar fine, it's just nothing, nothing to them, right? So it's a really big consideration. I don't think there's any answer to it yet. I think we're still working on it. Does that address your question at all?
I understand where you're going, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
There's no line up behind me, may I ask a second question?
You may.
Okay, thanks. A lot of what I have looked at in terms of smart cities is based on transportation. Now, it could be to help impoverished people and all that kind of stuff, but it's about that. So if I could take kind of the first question in that notion of transportation, someday we may have these autonomous vehicles or whatever going down. And there's lots of ways that we can have that work, vehicle talking to vehicle and so on, by setting up stations along the road. But it's the city that does that. So obviously a cost, but then there's that notion of data again. So where the city now gathers more data and owns it as it affects transportation, where do we go with legality? Where do we go with protecting people's rights and so on? Because we're not, although, you know, we're, I guess, big, in one respect, we're not very big at all. So it's that notion of, again, ownership and what do we do with that and how do we protect people?
Can I ask, when you did your Smart Cities proposal, was it transportation related? And if yes, how did you deal with that question in your grant application?
If we'd have done a better job, I might stand here with a different answer. But we looked at it in terms of first of all, efficiency. That would be one. And so we worked from a very basic level. And I'll call that efficiency and what that could do to enhance the area of the city that we were doing. So it had multiple layers, but we did not deal with that notion of, and again, I just identify, mostly because my friend is here, about 5G and what that means in the future and where we go with that. So.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. And something I think I would encourage you to take a look at is the Winnipeg Example, their Transportation Management Center. They have quite an interesting set of privacy guidelines that go along with it. And because they're using cameras at intersections, and that it raises a bunch of interesting issues, right? And when you have a camera, what is it picking up aside from what you want it to pick up? And so this is kind of where we start to think about, when you're collecting data, actually try to collect as little as possible, right? We've got this idea that any and all data, the more data, the better. But as you've noted, the more you start to collect data unintentionally, the bigger privacy problem you have. So what Winnipeg has done is they have tried to put cameras only in places where people have a reasonable expectation of privacy. They have no zoom function. So it can't zoom into a window. They have quite stringent controls over who can access camera footage. I believe they delete it within 7 days unless it is footage of an accident, in which case they might need to keep it longer. So they have all of these policies in place to try to deal with the fact that cameras pick up a lot of things we don't want them to. I think the more complicated question is the app partnership that they have with a company like Waze that's collecting all of this geolocation data, and I don't think the city of Winnipeg has control over what the app company does with that. So that it's the public-private partnership is something I think we're just starting to see some of the issues attached with that with regard to both privacy and cybersecurity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or points of discussion? Mike asked my one question, which was going to be, does Winnipeg delete the data? So I'm glad you talked about that. Go ahead, sir. State your name.
My name is Amardeep Verma. I'm from Saskatchewan. So the question is about, you touched initially on smart parking. So Saskatchewan has an interesting problem of weather. Sometimes, we get temperatures -40s. Obviously, smart parking has various components and processes, right? I mean, putting a puck on the road and tracking whether that slot is one process that can be solved. So do you have insights into how any of the cities that implemented smart parking, putting a puck, how the cost equation and ROI, and even putting such an infrastructure, I mean, it's massive, right?
Yeah.
So is it making sense for them, really? So what's the insight?
I think that's a great question. I think ROI is a really important question with a lot of smart cities projects, and I think the honest answer is that it's almost too soon to tell. Like, a lot of these projects are so new that they haven't begun to measure outcomes yet. So something like Winnipeg, for example, has been operational for a year or two, and that's the traffic management thing, and they haven't begun to publish metrics. They've promised that they're going to install car counters and let us know if it actually reduces congestion. But there hasn't been an outcome published yet, and I think that's the case with many, many cities, is the projects themselves are still in a phase of implementation such that the ROI either hasn't been measured or can't be measured yet, because they're all multi-year kind of programs. So I don't have a very good answer to that. I think we'll see. I think it'll be really interesting to see what cities begin to publish as they continue to work on them. Do you have an example of anyone you've seen kind of publish their outcomes?
So, yeah, I mean, I've read, I mean, I've not interacted with those directly, but, you know, so they are usable, definitely, but I've not seen where, when the sensors mostly, like we do trial actually with a lot of IoT sensors as part of our SASTL collaboration and innovation. So the problem comes when the temperature goes -20 and
Yeah.
below, right? Here in Saskatchewan, we can get like -40 as well, and these sensors stop reporting.
Yeah.
So if for 2 months, and then, you know, they are even the PUCs sensors that got submerged with snow, that's another problem, right? Which could be the case for 3 months here.
Yeah.
So I was really wondering, like, is there, and there was an RFI from City of Saskatoon sometime back, a few months back, which was asking, you know, to do these things. So I thought you touched the subject maybe.
Yeah,
It's-
no,
it
no,
could be an
the
interesting
weather
discussion.
question is really, really interesting, and is an interesting one across Canada, because so often, as you noted, it's an American conversation about smart cities, and they just don't anticipate things like snow or cold. So I think that's a fantastic question. I don't have a great answer for you, but I keep hearing examples of people, for example, installing LED smart lighting, but because they're LEDs, they don't warm up the snow sufficiently to melt it, and so you end up with just snowed over lighting instead. So I think there are lots of Canadian problems that we're going to have to try to solve as years go by. Yeah. Yeah.
Certainly, I think collaboration is the way, and great, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next question?
Good afternoon, and thank you for your presentation. Councillor Randy Golden from the City of Yorkton, 20,000 people. And I'm the SUMA Director for East Central Saskatchewan. Yorkton is the largest community in that area, and we work with many smaller communities. And I'm wondering, are there any best practices, or is there opportunities for some regional work with smaller communities? Because I think on our own, small communities in our area find it difficult, but collaboratively we could probably work together on doing some of this. And I'm just wondering if you have any examples or any place where we can see some best practices and learn from that.
That's a great question. I think I would direct you maybe to the proposals again for that Infrastructure Canada grant competition that they were holding in previous years, because as you know, there are so many small communities in Canada that not all of the proposals were from Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. A lot of them were from smaller confederations of smaller communities putting forward a joint proposal to work on bringing in some kind of infrastructure, or working on a smart energy plan, or working on a farming plan. And I think that there are a number of good examples in that grant competition of people making quite consolidated, well-organized plans, if that helps. So I would look up the, I can't think of a specific one. I know there were quite a few from rural Alberta and rural Saskatchewan. So the Infrastructure Canada Smart Cities Grant Competition, the proposals in there might be some interesting examples.
Bridgewater, Nova Scotia is 8,500.
Yep, yeah, and they, you can take a look at their materials, and they're doing some really, really interesting things. Again, as a municipality, they couldn't attract a big vendor to come help them out, and they've, I think, run with that and taken advantage of it almost, because they can work a lot more nimbly on their own.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah,
So just to add, my name is Alex Long with Infrastructure Canada's Smart Cities
Oh,
Challenge.
wonderful.
So we're at booth 5 in the trade show. We have a lot of case studies, a lot of examples, and can talk to anyone interested in about small community examples to larger communities, and you've given a great overview
Well,
of
thank you.
what
You
was
can probably
made in
answer the last
Canada.
question better than me.
And in terms of small communities, though, you can even see Parkland County, for example, in Alberta, had a really interesting rural agricultural focus. And in Saskatoon, which was a finalist for the $10 million prize, had a really interesting proposal around reducing Indigenous youth incarceration. So it wasn't just about transportation, it was about a lot of social issues. So come visit us, we have a lot of information for folks, and happy to talk to people.
Booth number 5.
Booth number 5.
Thank you.
Thanks for introducing yourself. That was great.
Can I ask a quick question about the Infrastructure Canada? Sorry, are you running another series of the grant competition, or are you going over what everybody kind of
Good
already
question.
submitted?
That is a great question. So we were originally funded to run up to 3 competitions, and
Okay.
so our first competition ended last May with the announcement of the winners. And we've spent the past few months it's an experimental program, so we're always looking at ways to change, tweak the eligibility, see really if it made sense in certain ways. So we are looking to launch a future round sometime this year.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, sir.
Good day, I'm Paul with SaskTel. I don't mean to turn this into a series of plugs for people that have booths and so forth, but when Randy asked a question, I wanted to suggest that, you know, as an example, in Saskatchewan, we're engaged with a small Saskatchewan city in an opportunity to render the location of their municipal infrastructure in real time on a smartphone. They see it's very much a collaborative process. It's not clear that there's going to be something at the end that creates value, but we're engaged in a collaborative way to do that. So from get the conversation started about what's of interest, and then, you know, we can bring some resources to bear. So we're at booth 186 and have the veal. It's great.
Great.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. Bob Hawkins from Regina. I want to ask about a little bit of a darker side about this. So if you go to many cities, particularly European cities, there's cameras now on every corner. And populations support that in the sense that they say, well, this is a great policing tool, and we see it used as a policing tool all the time. The other side of that is that it's a significant, or potentially a significant restriction on the freedom of individuals, and you see that sometimes in places like China. Is there any discussion about how you balance what the same technology on one side beneficial, but on another side potentially threatening?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think that's a great conversation that's growing. And it really has to do with the question of, again, buy-in and opt-out. And as policymakers, how do you regulate something like opt-out? If you have cameras on all of your streets, how do you allow a citizen to say, no, I don't want to be recorded? And so that's a judgment call that some places in the UK have made and said, no, you can't opt out. But I think that's going to continue emerging with things like driverless cars, right? If we have, let's say in 20 years, driverless cars on the roads, data shows that driverless cars have far fewer accidents. Do we allow someone to drive a non-autonomous vehicle, right? How do you decide whether or not you want a person to be able to opt out or buy in, and how much personal freedom you want to allow? I mean, it's a huge policy conversation. There's absolutely a dark side to it, and we're starting to see a lot of that. And I'm kind of hopeful that jurisdictions like the EU will continue to create policy frameworks like GDPR that allow people to say, I want my data deleted, so long as they haven't done anything wrong, which of course is tricky in and of itself. But I think, it's a big can of worms, and everything is so new that it's just beginning to kind of come to light. Things like the Strava app example, right, is not something we would have anticipated 5 years ago. So even data we think of as harmless can sometimes have unintended consequences. Another really interesting case study that's starting to come up is, even if you have a data set that has no personal information attached, you can't identify anybody from it. If as a municipality you have like one health data set like that, one geolocation data set like that, and then you merge those two, suddenly you have enough data points to actually tell who those people are, because just from a health record or just from a transit record, you might not be able to, but when they're put together, it's quite obvious who the people are. So that's not an answer to your question. I agree with you. I think that there's a big policy mess that we're going to have to slowly untangle.
So if you couple your observations with the problems you mentioned earlier about big companies like Google not being policeable, does that mean that smart cities are the death of privacy?
That's a great question. I mean, I also have hope that projects like that one I mentioned in Barcelona, where you can, as a individual, start to control who you share your data with, will start to catch on, will become more widespread, will be implementable. And I think that one kind of bright side to this conversation is that almost everybody's aware of the problems now, right? Like there's a lot more citizen education, a lot more awareness about privacy challenges and concerns. A lot of people are deleting their social media accounts. I think hopefully there will be enough citizen action that big companies have to pay attention, and then aligned with that, tools like that one being piloted in Barcelona that will allow citizens to have a bit more personal control.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sometimes it's fun being on the cutting edge, but in a way, it's not bad to let other people go down this road a few years before us, and they
Exactly.
can solve a lot of these problems before it gets to us. Sean?
Thanks. Sean McKenzie, Director of Advocacy Services with SUMA. I kind of want to pry in a little bit to the other side of that question. So one of the reasons it doesn't really worry a company like Google to have a couple $1 million worth of fines slapped on them is because they make billions on data. And that is going to be a more and more valuable commodity as we go on. Are there ways that cities should perhaps be looking at developing revenue streams around the aggregate data that they're collecting? Very small scale, I will admit, but when the SUMA office was in downtown Regina, I rode the bus for 10 years to travel to and from work. There's different kinds of bus passes that you can get that tells you student, senior, typical adult rider, child. Even just something as simple as taking the aggregate data of that to better target and sell digital advertising within a bus might be a potential revenue stream to develop ROI from. So just if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that's a fantastic question, and there's a lot of people who work in cities who might have different thoughts than I do, and I would welcome them to speak as well. From an external perspective, I think that where data is becoming both a buzzword in a positive way and a buzzword in a negative way, and really, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? Google has all of my data because I use their free services, and maybe the most important thing is, of course, data can help improve services, create revenue streams, and do a lot of really, really good things. I think transparency on what's being collected is kind of the most important thing that is missing now for a lot of people, which is why they're so cynical, why we are so cynical. I fall into that camp as well. But if I'm being told, this is what data is being collected about you, this is what it's being used for, often I have no problem with that. It's just a matter of knowing who's collecting it and what they're using it for, and whether or not it's going to be used to identify me. So I think that's a great question, and I think the answer is yes, if done well. But if anyone else has an alternative perspective, I'd love to hear it.
Anyone have a comment on that,
Or anything else.
or another question or comment? Councillor O'Donnell.
Just a comment, because you asked a question.
Yes.
We struggle greatly with a thing called revenue. We're well known in terms of the world of property taxes. We can charge fees by legislation that cover the cost of something, but the idea of making money is a whole different concept when you are a municipality. Now that's true in Saskatchewan. I'm not sure if it's true across Canada, but I suspect it is.
And even the idea of it can be controversial. Like the legality of it's one thing, but as Sean was asking his question, the hair on the back of my neck went up, thinking how that would play out in the media. I'm not opposed to the question. I think it's an excellent conversation we need to have, but boy, you need to control the communications on that question, or you're in big trouble. Right?
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead, sir.
just sharing my thought here, So as we have these discussions on data. I mean, there are segments in the population, right? I mean, there's even at today there is 15-20% of the population who doesn't care about sharing their data. I mean, because anyway on Twitter, Facebook, they are completely open to the public. So I see that there's this demographic divide which has 15-20% right now. I will say digitally open sharing kind of guys that will keep on increasing. So if we are able to tap on to that section of market and say that get a buy-in, I think those opportunities I guess are real, because having the data actually does help to improve that how can that really on the negative side as well, that what security was breached, what privacy was breached. Unless we experiment with that data on a smaller subset, I think we cannot innovate and will be always a laggard, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting experiment, I guess, to start with.
It's a really interesting conversation. And something else I keep hearing is that cities don't feel like they're allowed to experiment because, of course, they're using public dollars. So, you can't have an experiment that fails and then have a negative news story about it. So many pilot programs are not really feasible under the current model. So it's like you have to wait and see what other people are doing or get a grant. And it seems like a big challenge for a lot of municipalities.
Sure.
Probably time for another question, if anybody else has a question or a comment. Okay, I think we'll wrap it up there. Dawn, I wanted to say thank you so much for the presentation and the information. Fawn, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
For the information that you gave us. It was actually really encouraging to see that this applies to cities as big as Toronto or bigger, and all the way down to small towns. And the example you gave with Bridgewater was also encouraging to see not everything smart cities is smart. The example of the toaster was great. I think those are pitfalls that we're all worried about falling into. None of us wants to spend $5 or $10 million on the next Bluetooth toaster, in our city, where we launch a program and we think it's going to be perfect, and then you find out it's got problems or pitfalls with it. Just before we wrap up, did you want to talk a little bit about ICTC and what your role is in all of this as well?
Sure. So ICTC is a nonprofit research consulting and talent program organization. And I guess in addition to the brief overview from earlier, I'm a research and policy analyst working on our Smart Cities project. And so anyone who wants to reach out to me with a story about either what you're working on with your municipality or what your company's working on, we're working on a series of research projects about this right now and would love to hear from you. The other thing I just mentioned about this slide here is this is a bunch of sources from different examples. So if you want to read more about what Winnipeg or Toronto or Bridgewater is doing, there's some great ideas here.
Great.
Thank
Thank you
you
so much. Thanks again, Fawn. We really appreciate that. Let's give her one more round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We also want to thank our sponsor for this session, MNP. Thank you so much, Paul. We thank you for joining us today. Remember that the presentations are all going to be available on SUMA's YouTube channel within the month. So if you want to re-listen to this or recommend it to your colleagues, I think this would be an excellent session for colleagues of mine that weren't able to make it here today. Will be kicking themselves that they didn't attend. And so that'll be available on the SUMA YouTube channel. For those attending the SUMA Sure AGM, it's at 4:40 across the hall in meeting room 2. The welcome reception starts this evening in the Grand Ballroom just over there at 8 p.m. Breakfast tomorrow will be in the International Trade Center from 7:15 until 8:30. You folks have a good evening. We'll see you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.